Hannibal Lecter represents a fictional genius turned predator, a psychiatrist whose intelligence and manipulation seem superhuman. For decades, we've wondered, could you handle him if you crossed his path? Fiction suggests courage and wit might be enough, but reality tells a far more sobering story than any movie could ever capture. Thomas Harris introduced Hannibal Lecter to the world in 1981 through Red Dragon, crafting a character who would evolve across novels and films into something approaching modern mythology. The psychiatrist turned cannibal possesses surgical training, speaks multiple languages with fluency that borders on the academic, manipulates federal agents and fellow prisoners with terrifying ease, and commits acts of violence so calculated they feel more like performance art than murder. Anthony Hopkins immortalized him on screen with a performance that compressed all that malevolence into memorable silence and sudden strikes, while Mads Mikkelsen's television portrayal stretched the character across 3 seasons of psychological cat-and-mouse games that made the violence feel almost dreamlike in its aesthetic presentation. What makes Lecter so compelling to audiences is precisely what makes him so dangerous in concept. He represents the nightmare scenario where intelligence, medical knowledge, cultural refinement, and complete moral absence converge into a single human being. The question of whether you could handle him becomes a referendum on your own capabilities, your own intelligence, your own survival instinct measured against a fictional standard that was never designed to be realistic in the first place. If you're enjoying this breakdown of fiction versus reality and want more deep dives into characters who shouldn't exist, go ahead and hit that subscribe button because we're about to dismantle everything you thought you knew about handling predators. The clinical reality of psychopathy provides our first bridge between fiction and fact, because while Hannibal Lecter himself is impossible, the traits he embodies exist in measurable, documented forms. The Psychopathy Checklist Revised, developed by Robert Peyer and refined over decades of forensic research, quantifies characteristics like superficial charm, manipulativeness, lack of empathy, and grandiosity with strong concurrent validity across criminal populations. Neuroimaging studies from the past decade have repeatedly identified structural and functional differences in brain networks associated with empathy and moral processing amongst individuals, scoring high on psychopathy measures. These differences in the prefrontal cortex and amygdala help explain how someone can calculate harm without emotional interference. These findings ground Lecter's cold precision in biological plausibility, but here's where fiction diverges catastrophically from reality. Psychopathy explains the capacity for remorseless calculation, other than the superhuman execution that Lecter demonstrates episode after episode. Real individuals with psychopathic traits don't possess immunity to forensic science. They leave DNA evidence and fiber transfers and digital footprints just like everyone else. And they don't manipulate their way through institutional safeguards designed by teams of specialists. They certainly don't sustain decades-long careers of theatrical murder without the combined weight of law enforcement closing in with resources that dwarf any individual's ability to evade them. The most chilling aspect of Lecter's fictional existence isn't his violence itself, but the institutional failures that permit it to continue. The repeated scenarios where single investigators or psychiatrists sit across from him in environments that should never allow such intimate access. Consider the fundamental setup that drives The Silence of the Lambs' Clarice Starling, a trainee conducting interviews with a man who has killed and consumed multiple victims, in a cell that permits conversation, in sessions that extend long enough for psychological bonds to form. The fiction compresses this into mentor-student dynamic, frames it as necessary collaboration, makes the audience forget that every word Lecter speaks is a potential vector for manipulation, every silence a calculated pressure point, every kindness a tool for leverage. The novels and films return again and again to this motif of the one-on-one encounter because it creates dramatic tension. But it also creates a fantasy of individual capability that bears no resemblance to how institutions actually handle violent offenders with manipulative capabilities. Real maximum security psychiatric facilities don't permit the kind of extended, unsupervised contact that becomes the staging ground for Lecter's escapes, and real forensic interviews involve multiple personnel with recording equipment and legal oversight. Real risk assessment is a team-based process that specifically guards against the kind of boundary erosion that makes these fictional encounters possible. Handling Hannibal Lecter in reality wouldn't come down to matching his intelligence or outmaneuvering his manipulation, because the premise itself is fatally flawed from the start. Modern forensic investigation operates through institutional coordination that makes individual heroics rather than an unnecessary but actively counterproductive to safety and justice. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit despite its public mystique and undeniable contributions to criminal investigation, functions as one component within a massive apparatus of evidence collection, laboratory analysis, legal procedure, and multi-agency cooperation that no single offender can systematically defeat through cleverness alone. When you strip away the narrative compression that allows Lecter to exploit every gap, coincidence, and human error in his favor, what remains is a violent offender who would face forensic teams documenting every biological trace he leaves behind and surveillance systems that don't blink or grow tired. He would encounter correctional protocols specifically designed to minimize opportunities for manipulation through limited contact and controlled environments. He would face psychiatric evaluation conducted by specialists trained to recognize exactly the kind of boundary testing and emotional exploitation that Lecter deploys as weapons. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime publishes detailed guidance on managing high-risk prisoners, frameworks that emphasize segregation when necessary, strict monitoring of all interactions, multidisciplinary risk assessment, and institutional checks that prevent any single point of failure from compromising security. This means the very scenarios that drive Lecter's fictional power simply wouldn't materialize in properly functioning modern systems. The question, could you handle Hannibal Lecter, carries an implicit assumption that handling him is an individual task, something that comes down to your wits against his, your training against his experience, your moral clarity against his predatory focus. This assumption is exactly what makes the character so seductive and so dangerous as a cultural artifact, because it suggests that confronting evil is a test of personal merit rather than a systematic challenge requiring institutional resources, legal frameworks, forensic science, and collective action. Every time fiction presents the lone investigator or isolated psychiatrist as the one standing between Lecter and his next victim, it reinforces a mythology of individual capability that actively undermines the reality of how we actually protect people from violent offenders. The long-term damage isn't to your survival, except to your body or even your mind in some abstract sense. Because approaching a threat like Lecter with the assumption that you personally can manage him through intelligence or courage or professional skill is precisely the vulnerability he would exploit without hesitation. Real forensic professionals understand this implicity, which is why they work within systems designed to prevent exactly the kind of isolation and personal stakes that create exploitable weakness. Hannibal Lecter endures as a cultural figure because he represents something deeper than the sum of his fictional crimes. He embodies the terror of intelligence weaponized against humanity itself, refinement turned into camouflage for monstrosity. He represents the nightmare that the tools we associate with civilization, medicine, psychiatry, art, and language can be wielded by someone who feels nothing for the human beings those tools were designed to help. The character asks whether reason without empathy is still human, whether brilliance divorced from moral consideration becomes its own form of madness, and whether the institutions we built to contain violence can ever truly anticipate the creative cruelty that some individuals would deploy against them. But the fiction also does something more insidious by suggesting that matching Lecter requires becoming exceptional yourself, that handling him is a measure of your own worth, when the actual answer is far less romantic and far more reliable. You handle threats like Hannibal Lecter by refusing to face them alone, by trusting in institutional safeguards rather than personal prowess, by understanding that survival isn't about being the protagonist in someone else's dark story. It's actually recognizing when the only winning move is to let the systems designed for exactly this purpose do their work while you stay safely outside the blast radius. So could you handle Hannibal Lecter? If you're still confident in your own capabilities, you've already lost. The truth is, you don't handle him at all. Institutions do. Your role is accepting that some battles aren't tests of individual worth, but collective responsibilities requiring humility, procedure, and knowing when heroics become suicide. If this changed how you think about fictional predators versus real safety, drop a comment about which impossible character we should dismantle next, and subscribe because we're just getting started separating childhood fantasies from adult realities.